Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we sift through detailed sources, research, and biblical essays to extract essential knowledge and insight, custom-tailored for you.
Hello.
Today we're undertaking a deep exploration of what might, first glance, seem like a pretty minor detail in the Old Testament landscape, the Maacathites.
Right. And it's true, they appear in only a handful of verses, often, tucked away in geographical lists or battle rosters.
They do.
For many thoughtful Christians studying the Bible, they feel like an easy detail to just skip over. But our source material today, a carefully crafted essay for adult believers, shows us that focusing on these small elements is precisely where we can discover the grand structure of God's plan.
That's the core mission.
Yeah.
We're looking at a small, persistent people group on Israel's northern frontier to understand how even the footnotes of history can illuminate the major themes of God's covenant-keeping and His relentless moment-by-moment providence.
We're tracing their footprint, and their story isn't about imperial power, not at all. It's about the instruments God uses, these small actors who instruct His people about faithfulness.
Right.
And about compromise.
And this journey really starts, and I think it also ends, with a foundational truth about God's absolute sovereignty. Our essay anchors this whole discussion in Psalm 22, verse 28, which states, "For dominion belongs to the Lord, and He rules over the nations."
And if we can genuinely grasp that truth, then we start to understand that no matter how intimidating a geopolitical alliance might look, no matter how sturdy a border fortress stands, it cannot, by definition, outlast God's ultimate purpose for history.
That's the crucial theological lens we have to keep fixed as we examine the Maacathites. So let's begin by grounding ourselves geographically. I think this is essential to understanding the Maacathites' ability to, survive Israel's conquest in the first place. We need to know where they were.
Okay.
Our sources place Maacah firmly in the northern Transjordan region, specifically in the Upper Jordan watershed.
Right, so we're talking about land that forms the confluence of what is now the Golan Heights, Bashan, and Mount Hermon. If you look at a map, they're situated right next to the kingdom of Geshur.
And this wasn't marginal desert land, was it?
Oh, not at all. This was land that sat right along vital east-west trade paths. I mean, these were routes that connected the Mediterranean coast with the rising powers in Mesopotamia, so their location gave them a kind of disproportionate strategic value, despite their small size.
And the geography itself. It seems like that dictated much of their stature. You mentioned Bashan. When we hear that name in Scripture, what should that immediately evoke for us?
It should evoke strength, fertility, and resilience. Bashan was legendary for its rich volcanic soil. It was, in many ways, ancient Israel's breadbasket, a place known for these massive, healthy livestock and towering mighty oaks.
So it's almost a symbol.
It's used almost symbolically in the Bible to represent abundance and powerful stature, yes. Deuteronomy 32 praises the richness of the land, describing cattle fed in the pastures of Bashan. And Ezekiel 27 mentions the oaks of Bashan being used for the luxurious oars of mighty ships. So when the Maacathites are identified as occupying this region, it signals that they weren't some struggling, easily displaced tribe.
They held valuable territory.
They held desirable, defensible, and economically sustainable land. And that rich environment is a big part of why these border polities could persist against Israel's campaigns.
That detail about persistence brings us right to a critical piece of text, Joshua 13, which is really the historical bookend for this entire story.
That is.
The text explicitly records that Israel did not drive out the people of Geshur and Maacah. What's the significance of the phrase that follows? But Geshur and Maacah dwell among the Israelites to this day.
That phrase, to this day, it's a literary signpost. It's so important.
What does it signal?
It tells the original readers, and it tells us, that this wasn't merely a conquest failure in the distant past. It was a continuing, unresolved tension. It implies immediate physical proximity.
So they're neighbors, not distant enemies.
Exactly. Maacah was effectively a hostile enclave, a sovereign power sitting within the territories claimed by Israel, particularly the tribe of Manasseh. And that proximity meant constant interaction, economic, cultural, military, and that is where the spiritual risk begins.
And beyond just the physical land, they were deeply embedded in a powerful cultural network.
Yeah.
Our sources emphasize that Maacah was culturally kin to the Aramean sphere.
Absolutely. The Aramean people, centered eventually around the great city of Damascus, were becoming the dominant geopolitical and cultural force in the north during this early monarchy period.
And they shared what, language,
They
customs?
shared language, customs, religious outlooks. Makkah was a sort of border satellite in this orbit. Knowing this context immediately explains their later military alliances.
Right.
When the Ammonites sought aid against David, they naturally looked to the Arameans, and the Arameans in turn pulled in their culturally connected, strategically placed allies, like Makkah. It was a hostile, interconnected network directed against the expansion of Israel.
Let's move from the cultural sphere to the spiritual landscape. This is a land defined by high place cults and polytheism. What does that mean for Makkah?
Well, it means they lived in a world where religion was entirely pragmatic and civic. High place cults were these sites of local worship, often on hills or elevated ground, dedicated to regional deities.
The gods of the land.
The gods of the land, exactly. Across Canaan and Aram, the prevailing deities were associated with weather, fertility, war gods like Baal, and, critically for the Arameans, women.
And our essay brings up the story of Naaman here.
Yes, the commander healed by Elisha in 2 Kings 5. It's such a powerful example. When Naaman converts to Yahweh, his biggest concern is having to bow in the temple of Rimmon in Damascus because of his civic duty to the king.
It really illustrates that these weren't just private religious beliefs. They were interwoven with the fabric of society, holding immense civic and political prestige.
Immense. Storm gods and fertility deities were seen as the very source of power and provision for an agrarian society. If you wanted rain, a healthy harvest, or victory in battle, you supplicated them. And this created the starkest possible contrast with the faith of Israel.
How so?
Because the prophets insisted that these idols were mere constructs, the work of human hands, things that had to be carried around by their supposed worshippers, things that were utterly unable to save anyone.
So the theological challenge presented by Makkah and its neighbors wasn't just, will we win the next battle? It was something deeper.
It was, is the Lord our God truly sovereign over the heavens, or do we need to hedge our bets with the local storm god? It was a fundamental question of faith.
And the Bible's answer is clear.
Completely. Psalm 96 contrasts the gods of the nations with Yahweh, stating flatly that the Lord alone made the heavens and rules history. The persistence of Makkah was a perpetual spiritual risk because it placed that pagan political and religious power right on the boundary.
And we know how powerful those currents were.
We do, because as 1 Kings 14 sadly records, enduring high places dedicated to foreign gods existed within Israel's own territory. It's a sign that the nation had absorbed the spiritual resistance of its neighbors. Makkah represented that constant, insidious spiritual draw toward compromise.
This brings us to the core issue then, Israel's partial obedience. The essay highlights that Makkah's survival was really a reflection of Israel's failure to fully follow the initial commands of God.
Yes. When you look back at Deuteronomy 7, the commands were crystal clear and incredibly strict. Do not make covenants with these people and absolutely tear down their altars.
And these weren't just arbitrary rules.
No, they were protective measures. They were designed to protect Israel from the snare of idolatry and moral defilement. The Lord knew that tolerating these pockets of resistance, these rival cults, would inevitably lead to relational consequences.
I wonder though, and I think this is a fair question, was it really fair to blame Israel entirely? Conquering a fortified land like Bashan, occupied by powerful, established tribes. That was a monumental task. Wasn't there an element of pragmatic impossibility there?
That's a sincere and honest question, and one we really have to wrestle with. From a purely military standpoint, yes, it was incredibly difficult, no question.
Yeah.
But the biblical text doesn't frame it as a problem of impossibility. It frames it as a problem of will and fidelity. They had just witnessed God deliver far greater enemies into their hands.
So it was a choice.
The text suggests they preferred the path of pragmatic coexistence and diplomacy over the costly obedience of complete separation. The concession that Geshur and Akkah were tolerated in Joshua 13 became more than a military failure. It was a spiritual footnote, a documented failure to uphold the covenantal standard.
And we see the long-term cost of that footnote.
We certainly do, especially when those tolerated margins through marriage and alliance eventually lead to chaos in David's own house, particularly with Absalom's deep ties to Geshur.
So the strategic relevance of Makkah, then, is fascinating. This small border kingdom could wield disproportionate influence purely because of its strategic location and its ability to align with its major Aramean neighbors.
They were the classic hinge point. They could either be a buffer secured by treaty, or they could be a launch pad for invasion secured by an alliance with Damascus. In an era before massive, standing national armies, controlling these nodal points was everything.
But the Bible consistently pushes back against that kind of military thinking.
It does. It repeatedly cautions Israel against relying on the very visible strength the nations trusted in. The warnings in Psalm 20, some trust in chariots and some in horses, or in Isaiah 31, against relying on Egypt's horses. Those were incredibly potent for border kings.
Because that was the temptation.
Always. They were perpetually tempted to secure their borders by strategic pacts and alliances, trusting in horses and chariots rather than in the invisible sovereign power of the Lord.
So to conclude this section, Maacah, despite its small size, illuminates a vast theme. The Lord doesn't measure nations by acreage or armories, but by their posture toward his purposes.
Exactly. The fate of nations, both great and small, is determined by God based on their response to his will. Jeremiah 18 lays out this dynamic principle. If God declares disaster against a nation, but that nation repents, God will relent.
And the opposite is also true.
Conversely, if he promises good, but the nation rebels, he will withdraw his blessing. Maacah is a testament to this. Their continued presence was a test for Israel. Their eventual alignment against David placed them on the wrong side of God's redemptive purpose, and their defeat was a demonstration of his sovereignty.
That detailed setup brings us squarely into the narrative of the monarchy. We started with the land wreckers in Joshua 13, the explicit failure to drive out the Maacathites. Why is it so crucial that the ancient editor of the text included that failure?
Well, it serves as both a narrative and a theological warning. That phrase, to this day, doesn't just describe a geographical fact, it highlights a persistent covenant weakness.
A weakness that lasted for generations.
For generations after Joshua, these enclaves, Maacah and Geshur, posed constant tests of fidelity. During the chaotic period of the Judges, Israel was struggling to maintain its own identity. These border communities were indispensable trading partners, perhaps, but their presence exerted constant cultural pressure,
Pressing them toward compromise.
pressing Israelite hearts toward pragmatic coexistence that blurred the lines of holiness. Judges 2 describes how this compromise created thorns in their sides and snares in their hearts. The Maacathites were one of those thorns.
That long-standing tension sets the stage perfectly for the key relational entanglement that occurs during David's rise to power.
Yes, the narrative thread becomes very personal here. David, while establishing his kingdom and consolidating power, made what seemed like a shrewd political move.
He married Maacah.
He married Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, who is the king of Geshur, and this union produced one of the most critical figures in David's tragedy, Absalom.
I want to pause here. You mentioned that political marriages were common statecraft. As the rising king, David needed to consolidate his northern flank. Was this marriage really a spiritual failure? Or was it just a prudent, necessary diplomatic move?
That's a thoughtful question, and it captures the tension perfectly. From a purely human perspective, you could say it was brilliant statecraft. It secured a strategic frontier without bloodshed and gave David access to the northern Aramean sphere. But the biblical critique is rooted in the covenant law we discussed earlier, the clear prohibition against intermarriage and alliance with non-covenantal peoples. The very fact that this foreign queen bore him a son who would later become the greatest threat to his throne reveals the ultimate cost.
So the pragmatism came at a high price.
A very high price. It entangled the promised covenantal royal line with a court that had no loyalty to Yahweh.
And that cost didn't become apparent until tragedy struck. The relationship became painfully relevant when Absalom, having murdered his half-brother Ammon, needed a sanctuary from justice.
That's right. Where did the fugitive murderer run? He fled to Geshur, his mother's homeland, where he found refuge with his grandfather, King Talmai, for 3 long years.
A seemingly incidental detail that's actually hugely significant.
It is. Absalom having a safe haven outside of Israel underscores the contested nature of those borders. The diplomatic tie, intended to be a source of security, became a mechanism for avoiding justice, and that destabilized the royal house from within.
So the pragmatic alliance of the father enabled the criminal escape of the son. It's a powerful demonstration of the long tail of compromise.
It illustrates that the failure to fully consecrate the margins led to relational turmoil at the very center of God's plan, the Davidic dynasty.
Now let's turn to Maacah's most explicit military involvement, which occurred before Absalom's return. In the crisis detailed into 2 Samuel 10, this is where Maacah actually commits troops against Israel.
This is a major test for David's kingdom. The crisis began when David's messengers were shamefully mistreated by the Ammonites. In preparation for the inevitable war, the Ammonites recognized their own lack of military strength, and they sought mercenary aid.
So they hired soldiers.
They hired massive Aramean contingents, including forces from Beth-rehob, Zobah, and critically for our study, they specifically pulled in the king of Maacah with 1,000 men.
1,000 men might sound like a small number to us, but in that context, especially considering the professional nature of Aramean contingents, that was a significant commitment for a small territory like Maacah.
It was. It illustrates their dedication to the anti-Israel coalition. And this created a massive strategic problem for David. His commander, Joab, was faced with a daunting two-front threat.
The Ammonites in their city and the mercenaries in the field.
Exactly. The Ammonites fortified in the capital, Rabbah, and this vast mercenary Aramean coalition, including the Maacathites forces, positioned in the open field. The military imbalance must have looked overwhelming.
This is where we get one of the most powerful covenant statements in the historical books. Joab's exhortation, when faced with this dual threat, is absolutely crucial.
It serves as a beautiful pivot point, shifting the focus from military odds to divine sovereignty. Joab divided the army to fight both fronts and delivered this powerful charge.
Be strong, and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight.
Right. And that confession anchors courage not in their superior numbers or tactics, which they likely didn't have, but in the ultimate purpose of God.
It's a statement of duty combined with submission. We will do everything within our strength, but the final outcome is determined by the sovereign Lord.
And that faith was instantly rewarded. Israel prevailed over both the Ammonites and the Arameans. The essay details that when the Aramean contingents regrouped after that initial defeat, David himself led a decisive counterattack.
A crushing victory.
It was so crushing it led to the death of their commander and the loss of chariots that it broke the will of the major Aramean states, like Zobah, to aid Ammon further. This essentially cut the lifeline that had drawn Maacah into the conflict.
So Maacah's 1,000 men were routed.
Utterly routed as part of this larger defeat.
Yet, despite the military defeat of their allies, the relational entanglement with Geshur, Maacah's neighbor and kin, persisted. The story of Absalom's return, mediated by Joab, proves that the familial line remained complicated.
It does. Absalom's mother, the Geshurite princess Maacah, ensured that the connection remained strong enough for him to secure a safe 3-year refuge. And when Joab engineered his return, the complexities of these border ties continued to complicate justice in the capital.
Absalom returned, but justice was deferred.
Which led to his eventual rebellion. The entire trajectory of David's life, his strength, his sin, his discipline, was inextricably linked to this seemingly small strategic marriage.
So the divine hand is clear throughout this narrative. The victory over the Maacathites demonstrates God's protection, but the subsequent family tragedy shows God using the very entanglements they chose to discipline his people.
That is the essential insight. God's ultimate promises to David were never imperiled, even by this chaos. The covenant in 2 Samuel 7 guaranteed the establishment of David's throne, but it also guaranteed discipline for his sins and the consequences of his choices.
So God keeps his promise, but not by ignoring the sin.
No, he disciplines and steers his people, keeping his ultimate covenant promise, even as he exposes the high cost of compromise. Psalm 89 speaks to the certainty of this preservation. Even if David's descendants stray, God will not renounce his covenant. The story of Maacah is a small piece of evidence supporting that great promise.
Let's transition now to the theological significance, starting with this concept of partial obedience and covenant fidelity. Our source material frames Maacah's persistence as a crucial tile in the mosaic of Israel's uneven compliance with God's commands.
We must reiterate that this was more than just a military failing. It was a deep spiritual crisis. The failure to fully remove the pagan presence was a heart problem that guaranteed future covenant instability.
The essay uses the comparison to yeast.
Yes, from Galatians 5. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. It's so apt. Tolerating the Maacathites was allowing a small amount of spiritual yeast to remain, guaranteeing that the entire spiritual loaf would eventually be corrupted by syncretism and compromise.
And the protective intention behind the commands in Deuteronomy 7 to tear down altars to avoid covenants was aimed precisely at preventing this slow slide toward idolatry.
It was. The physical presence of Maacah, a functioning, visible Aramean state with its high-placed cults, was a constant temptation. It made it much easier for Israel to make the choice David eventually made, to use intermarriage as a political tool.
So when Israel relented on those strong commands, they essentially chose short-term political stability over long-term covenant purity.
They did. And the Maacathites enduring on the border were the living, breathing evidence of that compromise, leading directly to the very relational entanglements that God intended to prevent.
This issue of compromise ties directly into the moral logic of the international scene, which the Bible frames using the Abrahamic promise in Genesis 12. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse.
This promise acts as the supreme theological lens for interpreting all subsequent geopolitical events involving Israel. It teaches us that nations are not autonomous entities. They are morally responsible to God for how they treat his covenant people.
So when the king of Maacah supplied those 1,000 men to the coalition,
He was knowingly aligning his small realm against the people through whom God had promised to mediate blessing to the world. That action placed his kingdom under the explicit judgment of the Abrahamic curse.
and the victory David achieved wasn't just a military triumph.
No, it was the Lord acting in alignment with his promise, frustrating the plans of the foreign coalition, regardless of their superior numbers. Psalm 2 speaks to this universal truth. Why do the nations rage? Their plans are ultimately frustrated by the one who sits in the heavens and laughs.
We must connect this divine action to the theological backbone of the Old Testament, the Davidic covenant. How does the brief story of the Maacathites speak to this eternal promise?
Well, the Davidic covenant guaranteed an established house, throne, and kingdom forever. The fact that David was successful against a seemingly overwhelming coalition, including Maacah, proves that God was actively preserving the messianic line.
So David's security was a pledge from God.
A pledge that the ultimate king, the son of David, would arrive. The victory was a guarantee of preservation, even amidst David's own human failures.
So God preserves the line, but he also purifies it.
Precisely. The scriptures confirm that the plans of the Lord stand firm forever. The military victory secured the immediate physical line, and the subsequent discipline, the Absalom saga, ensured the spiritual purity of that line through correction. God's preservation is comprehensive, spanning military threats and moral failures.
This distinction between Israel as a covenant nation-state and the universal church is critical for us today. We can't simply take these ancient military mandates and apply them directly to our modern lives.
No, we absolutely must resist flattening these ancient wars into timeless military warrants for the church. The church is not a geopolitical entity. We do not inherit Israel's territorial mandates regarding the literal occupation of land, nor do we engage in military conquest for spiritual purity.
So if we don't conquer territories, what is the church's mandate regarding the nations?
Our mandate is spiritual, global, and missional. We proclaim the crucified and risen Son of David to all nations. We testify to the world that Jesus is the true final king whose kingdom is not of this world, but who nonetheless governs this world.
We witness to the nations,
Knowing that God still governs their rise and fall, using their political structures, their wealth, and even their hostility to advance his saving purposes.
that is a fundamental shift in perspective. If God determines the times and exact boundaries of nations, as Acts 17 says, what is the ultimate purpose behind that?
The purpose is always redemptive. He sets the boundaries so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. This profoundly changes how we view international relations. We don't view rival nations as merely military problems. We view them as populations placed within God's timeline, specifically for the possibility of finding him.
Finally, let's look at progressive revelation and sanctification. How did God use the Maacathites to discipline and purify his people?
God uses both the blessing of victory and the pressure of consequence. David's triumph over the coalition was a visible sign of God's protective hand, a moment of profound grace. But the lingering border entanglement with Geshur, which protected Absalom, exposed the hidden cost of compromise. That exposure led to heartbreak and civil war, providing painful, undeniable instruction.
And this instruction, this discipline, is itself a form of grace.
It is the ultimate expression of love. Our sources remind us, echoing Hebrews 12, that the Lord disciplines those he loves to ultimately yield a harvest of righteousness and peace. Maacah, though a small thread in the tapestry, served as a crucial instrument both of God's preservation and his fatherly discipline for his anointed.
We've moved through the history and the theology. Now let's make sure this ancient story lands squarely in the modern experience of the thoughtful believer. So how do we take this ancient story and apply it to our lives today?
Well, the first lesson comes directly from that battle in 2 Samuel 10, trusting God over visible strength. That Ammonite Aramean coalition, including the Maacathites, was numerically superior and geographically overwhelming.
And yet it dissolved.
It dissolved under the Lord's intervention. This is the enduring truth of Psalm 33. No king is saved by the size of his army, but our hope is in the Lord. Physical armaments, whether they're military or financial, are a vain hope for deliverance compared to the power of the living God.
This principle runs so counter to our human instinct, which is constantly calculating risk based on resources. How does this apply to the church's calling in the modern world?
It means our calling is to reject the temptation to imitate the world's power structures. We don't rely on political dominance, massive budgets, or worldly strategic alliances to advance the kingdom. Our trust must be in ordinary, faithful obedience, even when resources look thin and opposition looks formidable.
We're reminded of the treasure in jars of clay.
Exactly, the power of God working through weakness. The victory isn't secured by our size, it's secured by His purpose.
The second major lesson is the serious warning against unequal yokes, which we see in David's pragmatic marriage to the Geshurite princess. That alliance was meant to stabilize the border, but it destabilized his family.
This is a warning about the insidious nature of compromise, what we call the hidden cost of coexistence. David's political maneuver created a lasting relational web that complicated his administration of justice and directly fueled Absalom's path to rebellion.
So the relationships we choose have real spiritual consequences.
They inevitably shape the trajectory of our lives and the spiritual tests we face.
If we translate the Maacathites alliance into modern terms, it's not just about marriage. It's about any deep, binding alliance where we sacrifice core covenant principles for some temporary gain.
Absolutely. The warning from 2 Corinthians 6 is timeless. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. This applies to marriage, yes, but also to business partnerships, deeply compromising political affiliations, or social groups where the required behavior contradicts the pursuit of holiness.
You have to ask.
You have to ask, what fellowship can light have with darkness? The point is that we must not enter alliances where fidelity to Christ is structurally compromised.
I think many sincere believers struggle with this application. Are we supposed to withdraw entirely from the culture around us? How do we balance this warning against the call to be salt and light in the world?
That's a crucial distinction the essay helps us make. The warning is not a call to social isolation. We must be witnesses in the world. But we must maintain what the essay calls a consecrated center.
A consecrated center. What does that mean?
This is where Christ remains preeminent, where our primary loyalty is fixed. We can engage professionally, politically, and socially with non-believers, but we cannot create binding alliances that force us to compromise our ethical or spiritual identity.
So it's about our core loyalty.
Yes. When relationships or external pressures start pulling our core loyalty away from Christ, that is the moment to reconsider the depth of that entanglement.
Let's look at Joab's model of courage, the third application point. His words on the battlefield are just so profoundly encouraging.
They offer a perfect template for spiritual engagement today, Joab said. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in His sight. This teaches us to pursue duty with vigor while submitting the outcome to God's sovereignty.
So we do our best, but we don't obsess over the results.
Precisely. We are called to act boldly and faithfully in the tasks God has assigned us, whether that's defending truth, raising godly children, or serving in our community. But the spiritual power comes from resting the ultimate outcome entirely in the Lord's hands.
And this combination guards us against two dangers.
Two major dangers, yes. First, presumption, relying solely on our own ingenuity and strength, which leads to exhaustion and pride. And second, paralysis, the fear caused by obsessing over the overwhelming appearance of the opposition, which stops us from acting at all.
Joab's posture is confident because it's God-reliant.
Not self-reliant. That's the key.
Finally, the story of Maacah encourages a sober perspective and a commitment to prayer for nations. How does their small story inform our global view?
It reminds us that God is actively engaged in directing world history. The lesson from Psalm 33 is undeniable. God foils the plans of the nations and thwarts the purposes of the peoples. His governance is constant, wise, and absolutely unstoppable.
Knowing that God's plans stand firm forever, what is the practical role of the believer within this geopolitical framework?
Our role is to pray for those in authority over us and to actively seek the welfare of the cities and countries where we live. Our ultimate stability, the unshakable certainty we rely on, is not based on who wins the next election or which treaty is signed, but on the enduring kingdom of God.
And that perspective is liberating.
It is, and it forces us to reconsider even our neighbors and our enemies. We're reminded that God determined the very existence, the times, and the exact places where all people should live for the specific purpose that they would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him.
So the story of the Maacathites is ultimately not just a warning.
It's also a global call to mission and intercessory prayer, even for those who align themselves against us. When we look back at the Maacathites, their history is modest but mighty in what it reveals. They persisted despite Joshua's incomplete conquest, symbolizing Israel's uneven fidelity. They supplied vital troops to the anti-Israel coalition, only to be utterly defeated by David. And through the familial ties with Geshur, they became central to the dark family drama that defined Absalom's path.
They really are a case study in how God uses even the smallest nations for instruction.
They are.
And their very smallness serves to magnify the God who is not small. The sovereign Lord, the architect of history, numbered their 1,000 men and wrote their story into his massive, comprehensive design.
It reminds us that there are no coincidences in providence.
None. Every detail, every breed cameo in Scripture teaches us enduring lessons about faithfulness and the costs of compromise.
And the essential confession that the Lord continually presses upon his people, both ancient and modern, is captured in Psalm 20, verse 7. This confession must guide our reliance and our confidence. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God.
That keeps us from ever confusing our methods or our strategic alliances with the mercy and deliverance that comes only from his hand.
Right.
And as we close this deep dive, the Maacathites point us ultimately toward the final perfect resolution of history. Every contested border, every painful consequence of compromise, every failed alliance, it all reminds us that history is ordered toward the reign of David's greater son.
We look to Jesus.
We look to Jesus, whose kingdom will not pass away, whose throne is eternal, and whose peace will finally settle every conflict and establish ultimate justice across the globe.
Let us return to the powerful encouragement that undergirds this entire study. It's a bedrock truth for all believers navigating a chaotic world, from Psalm 33.
The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations.
That is the enduring truth we take away. Our deepest stability today, whether in the face of personal challenges or global anxiety, is rooted not in geopolitical alignment, superior planning, or personal strength, but in the enduring, unshakable purposes of God's heart.
May you walk today and every day in the confidence that the plans of the Lord stand firm forever.